Thelma's life on the Caney River didn't align with her gregarious nature or stem from the essence of who she was. She was wonderfully favored, but it seemed like she was enjoying someone else's reward. It was like living in concentric circles of exile from what mattered to her. Exile from Texas, from family, from church, and even from the company of others. Her favored existence gradually took on the quality of being habitual. But the word habitual had also come to define her marriage. George was a good man, but she wondered if he defined the word company as merely being in someone else's presence. To Thelma, he seemed preoccupied with an internal dialogue that did not require her input or participation. Perhaps, she thought, his business had drained him, exhausted him, and left him in a state of distraction. But then she started to entertain another possibility, one she had never considered in any previous relationship. Perhaps what drained and exhausted him was her. She began to twist in a strange and foreign place called self-doubt, which acted like a tax on everything that made her vibrant and entertaining. To Thelma, Conchita seemed less and less like an ally, and more like the only means to reconnect with herself. Yes, Thelma now had a 4-year-old son, also named George, but Conchita represented the last remnant of the social constellation she had once charmed so effortlessly and attracted like the sun. Those connections were now drifting further and further away, becoming invisible, destined ultimately to fade away. However, the truth about her husband had nothing to do with his lack of feelings for her. True, he was not prone to elaborate conversation, but Thelma had always known this about him. Initially, she even found it disarming and strangely appealing. What she did not know, or at least failed to appreciate, was that two events occurring far away had now walked up the stairs, were standing on their porch, and knocking on their front door. First, there had been a stock market crash on Wall Street. By Thelma's reckoning, New York and Oshaleta were barely on the same continent. Yet, in the world of finance, a bank in Oklahoma might just as well have been in the lobby of a bank in New York. The reasons money flowed out of people's savings accounts at Chase National also explained why money exited the Bank of Oshaleta. People everywhere were fearful, and farmers in Oklahoma were starting to realize that only 10% of what had been loaned out was actually on deposit. Second, America faced its first significant ecological disaster, the Dust Bowl. A nearly decade-long drought began to strike Oklahoma. This drought, coupled with persistent high winds, eroded the topsoil from the farms that formed the very backbone of the region's economy and were the primary reason the Bank of Oshaleta even existed. George was initially shocked by Thelma's yes to his marriage proposal. If he had been a betting man, he would have assumed that the yes she wrote at the bottom of his letter would be a no. What he most wanted, actually, from his proposal was not her acceptance so much as freedom from regret for never having asked. The yes was simply too unexpected and exceptional for him to consider completely reasonable. Her unexpected compliance left him feeling that something so unpredictable and precious must also be fragile. Without fully considering his motives, he built a life for them designed to protect what he did not deserve. He placed this lovely feathered creature, which had perched on his finger for no apparent reason, in an exquisite cage that would keep her from flying away and shield her from anything that might challenge her captivity. Unfortunately, with the onset of the Depression, that ambition became increasingly difficult to achieve. With each inadequate loan and every forsaken farm, he tried to reaffirm the qualities that had always brought him success. 10-hour workdays turned into 12 and then 14. Oversight of his employees and those struggling to repay what could not be repaid made him rigid, demanding, and unforgiving. He sensed that his obsessiveness was transforming him into a caricature of himself as he desperately sought to protect his life on the Caney from any hint of collapse. All the while, the most difficult thing to preserve from change was himself. He became increasingly distant, distracted, and short-tempered. The woman toward whom all these efforts were directed was now burdened by the company of a man unable to share the truth. The pressure of his unexpressed circumstances became unbearable, even as the value he brought to his wife as a partner evaporated. All of this progressed relentlessly through the fall of 1931. However, as the holidays approached and their overwhelming demands for celebration and gratitude became apparent, they both felt a sense of failure. Christmas Eve of that year dawned, and George was once again off to work before the sun came up. This morning, Thelma remained in a half-empty bed, listening to distant church bells, anticipating a celebration that she would not be attending. The sound of young George's feet on the linoleum floor prompted her to sit up. But there she paused, hesitating to face another day of a life that seemed successful, but was hollowed out by its absence. Her stasis continued as she waited for something to end it. The random noise of something falling or a call from her child, anything that would compel her to stand and move. Finally, Conchita opened the front door and found her young charge balanced on a piano bench, reaching for a knick-knack. "Georgie, you get down from there," she called out. Her command was followed by bare feet landing on the floor with a thud. That was the sound that Thelma needed to finally stand up and begin her day. The morning progressed according to a pattern established years before and repeated nearly every day since. What set this day apart was a Christmas tree and all the accompanying wreaths, candles, and decorations. However, these seasonal reminders seemed to have a counterproductive effect on Thelma's mood. She moved about as if she were missing something or someone and struggled to cope with a sense of absence. Conchita sensed Thelma's mood and made allowances for it. From experience, she knew that taking the initiative with Thelma wouldn't always be that effective. So Conchita bustled about, prepared breakfast, and attended to whatever minor disorder needed her attention. Sometimes it was best to simply act as if Thelma weren't there. Gradually, Thelma's expression of being lost and distant would fade, and she would revert to her old, gregarious, talkative self. Yet these periods of her absence, even when she was present, became increasingly frequent, especially now with the arrival of the holidays. As lunchtime approached, something unusual happened. Outside was the sound of a vehicle, something unexpected at a place that seldom had visitors. Thelma, Conchita, and little George went to a kitchen window and saw an ugly, dilapidated bus pull up. It had been painted with house paint to hide its rust, and the words, "Jesus Saves," were hand-printed along its side in large, amateurish letters. A group of carolers emerged from the bus, lining up in front of the house as they began to sing, "O Little Star of Bethlehem." The first few bars of the melody transformed Thelma. She threw open the front door and stood on the porch listening to music she hadn't heard in 6 years. There she stood, every trace of her earlier mood erased, with tears streaming down her cheeks. One can only imagine the reaction of these carolers upon seeing this woman, a stranger to their congregation, responding to their Christmas hymns as if Christ himself were singing to her. For Thelma, it felt as though all the doubt and disappointment of her sad, isolated self had suddenly been washed away. These hymns called out to her from a time and a place that she cherished and terribly missed. They reminded her of her faith and an identity she had lost and so desperately wanted to reclaim. Nowhere had these carolers found a better audience. The only indication that their visit was nearing its end was when they sang the last carol from their lengthy book of hymns. Once Thelma realized that every last one of the 12 days of Christmas were over, she stood momentarily and then dashed back into the kitchen. There she grabbed a large cookie jar filled with the leftover currency and spare change accumulated from years spent on the caney. She rushed back onto the porch, ran down the stairs, and emptied the entire contents of the oversized jar into their bucket. The bus had taken a long route to reach their home, but from their reaction, it was clear they had received a much larger donation than they had anticipated. Thelma held the now empty cookie jar in one hand and enthusiastically shook hands with each caroler. Then, as the bus drove away, she waved to them, shouting wishes for a Merry Christmas. With the mood of the home significantly changed, the rest of the day was spent wrapping presents away from little George and preparing an elaborate dinner for Christmas Eve. It was a pleasantly exhausting undertaking, the final stages of which were marked by dropping temperatures and falling snow. The first appearance of snow was welcomed as a tribute to Christmas. However, in a way uncharacteristic of Oklahoma, the snowfall grew increasingly heavy. And in a manner very characteristic of Oklahoma, the wind picked up speed. As the hour grew later, concern began to mount because George had yet to arrive, as the roads were becoming now less passable. Conchita's anxiety was particularly acute because she was eager to spend Christmas with her family, and her ride home depended on Mr. Pence. As it approached 7 o'clock, footsteps were heard on the porch. A knock on the door, though, quickly undermined the relief that sound provided. If it had been George, there wouldn't have been a knock. And if it wasn't George, who would knock on their door so late at night, on Christmas Eve, and in the middle of a storm? The likely candidates included the police, which was an instant source of panic. Thelma hesitated to approach the door without first saying a prayer. Conchita had no such hesitation. She quickly grabbed the doorknob and flung the door open. Standing there was not a policeman, but a bedraggled bum who was clearly Mexican. His skin was dark, and he had a long, scruffy beard that was primarily white. He wore a thin coat that barely stayed together. On his feet were the remnants of shoes, with the uppers mostly held to the soles by twine. Conchita's initial reaction was a blend of curiosity and pity. But then she soon felt humiliated by the sight of him standing there like a billboard, advertising every negative stereotype about Mexicans. His presence, timing, and appearance were utterly unsuitable. Everything about him was unacceptable, and Conchita was embarrassed. She quickly began speaking to him in Spanish because she wanted to deliver instructions for him to leave in a way that if Thelma heard, she might find objectionable. He listened to her, but responded by ignoring what she had to say. Instead, he produced a whetstone from his pocket and also in Spanish requested that he sharpen some of their cutlery for a nominal fee. As this request concluded, Thelma came to the door. She saw a desperate man in dire circumstances, the very image of poverty and need. She also believed that if she ever needed God's good grace during a difficult hour, it was now. For her, it would be wrong to send this man away without some provision for Christmas, especially in light of a Bible passage that came readily to her mind. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. What is he asking for? Thelma asked. He wants to sharpen cutlery for a price, Conchita responded in a way that allowed you to hear her teeth coming together. Well, ask him in. I think we have a few dull knives. Conchita turned to him and delivered the invitation in a very condensed form of Spanish. As he entered the kitchen, Conchita pulled out a chair, grabbed a clean cloth, and placed that cloth on the chair before inviting him to sit down. She then retrieved a few knives from a drawer, not because they needed sharpening, but because she wanted to see how quickly they and this hobo could be dealt with. While he was drawing the knives across his whetstone, Thelma suddenly realized that she had no way to pay him. Every cent in the household was in the cookie jar she had dumped into the caroler's pail. Many years later, she told me that at that moment, a thought that would fill her with lasting shame came to mind. She would relieve herself of all responsibility by making him an offer that seemed generous, but was impossible for him to accept. She told Conchita to apologize for their lack of money and then tell him that instead of a few quarters, they'd see if her husband's shoes wouldn't fit him. She planned for Conchita to hand him those oddly sized shoes. They'd wait while he tried to put them on, and once that struggle resulted in failure, Conchita would express their regrets, take back the shoes, and see him to the door. Conchita delivered my grandmother's offer. A long pause followed, and then he looked up, but not at Conchita. Instead, he looked directly at my grandmother, a woman he still had not been introduced to. And he said in perfectly unaccented English, "Oh, Thelma, thank you for your offer. But your husband's shoes would never fit me. You see, I wear a size 9.5 AAA. It was the exact shoe size of her husband, and it was shared by less than 1% of the male population. His response, using that shoe size exactly, was like the word guilty in a judge's reading of a verdict. Thelma felt convicted of a gross violation of the law of charity. She had been given a chance to offer love, but instead had offered subterfuge and evasion. God, in the person of this angel, had called her to account for what her faith required, and she revealed herself as weak and insufficient. It was a miserable moment in a day with its share of miserable moments. Yet she would come to believe that this was precisely the misery she needed to find her way to something better. Thelma stood silent for a second, then went to her bedroom. She collected a pair of socks and a pair of scissors, and then looked for a pair of shoes. Opening the closet, she bent down and picked up the pair of George's wingtips, colored cordovan and cream, that Conchita so despised. Then she went to the bathroom, filled a large enameled basin with warm water, and grabbed a soap bar and washcloth. Once all had been delivered to the kitchen, she knelt at the feet of the Mexican derelict and cut twine as his shoes fell away in parts. She rolled away his socks, worn so long that they were almost married to his feet. She placed those feet in the enameled bowl and ran the soapy cloth under each of his arches and between every toe. Then she dried those feet, which she now held in her lap, and covered them with new woolen socks. At last, the shoes slipped on with the ease of perfectly fitting gloves. Once the shoestrings were tied, she sat on the floor, looking down at his feet in a pose that suggested humility and a plea for forgiveness. He stood up and placed his hands on the crown of her head, letting the weight of his affection rest there for a moment. Then he stepped aside and walked to the front door, accompanied by no one. He turned and smiled at them both, opened the door, and walked out into the storm. Thelma felt assailed by that storm, which the word weather could only partially describe. It now held her angel, and she wondered if it would accept him in exchange for her husband.